This is The Road Show, and I'm your host, David Warren. On today's program, we welcome back author and businessman John Mason. He's best known for his best-selling classic, An Enemy Called Average. He is anything but average, and he's our guest for the hour. Let's welcome back the very friendly and funny John Mason.
Thank you, David. I hope I'll be somewhat funny, maybe lighten the load for some folks today.
I am sure of that. John, let's talk about what it means to be average. Define average.
Well, I think, being average is just being what you're not supposed to be. Finding in whatever that unique thing is that God wants you to be is really the thing that all of us should really strive for. And anything that takes us kind of off of that path, by choice or, maybe other people have influenced you that way, is really not God's best for us. And we know that he has a good plan for every single person here. And, so the idea of average is not comparing one to another. That's not the way to do it, but to compare what God wants you to do with how you're doing and to really evaluate not necessarily where you are today, but what trajectory are you on? Are you facing in the right direction?
All right. So that is why it is our enemy, because it pulls us off the trajectory of where God wants us to be.
Well, it's a temptation, the biggest enemy of great is good, kind of an idea. And, so I'm always, the book itself is, I talk about 52 different subjects in that one book. And I'll tell you why people like my books, David, and that's because my chapters are typically 2 pages long. So they can read 4 chapters and feel really proud, and they only have to read 8 pages. And back when I wrote that book, that's been, in June of this year, this will be 27 years ago. Nobody was writing short chapters at all. And so it was kind of different, and people seemed to connect with it. And that was about my attention span anyway, so that seemed to work for people.
Have you noticed how a lot of pastors, especially in the charismatic world, quote you in their sermons?
Oh, yeah. That's been kind of a fun thing over the years, seeing them on TV or... some guys have even said, I can't bring you to my church because I've quoted you too much.
And they think it was the pastor.
I think they're joking, but it's an honor. I mean, it and it's been everywhere. I mean, I've had people from all walks of life. I wrote another book called You're Born an Original, Don't Die a Copy, which is probably as quoted a line as probably any I've come up with. But yeah, it's been fun. I think that's part of the challenge and part of the fun of doing what I do. Was there ever a time in your life, John, that you were average? Well, I still think I fight it every day. I mean, I think that God has given people gifts and talents. And my normal prayer is, Lord, give me some opportunities, some small opportunities, usually what I say, to use what you put inside of me. And yeah, I think I contend with that. The story that kind of launched this book idea happened to me years ago. I was in Tulsa reading the Tulsa World, and in the Tulsa World was actually a story that was a national story by the Associated Press. And this story was all about what the average American was. So they began to describe what the average American was. And the average American had this amount of income. The average American had this value in terms of home. And I saw, wow, that's me. And then he continued, and the average American had 2 children at that time, the ones that were married. And I had 2 children at that time. And then I started beginning to think, man, this is really strange. They're describing me as the average American. And then it continued, and amazingly, it said at that point in time, and that had to be more than 30 years ago, that the most common name for a man at the time was John. And on top of all of this, the most common female name was Linda, which just so happens to be my wife's name. And I got agitated over that. It kind of riled me up, and I said, I'm not average. You're saying I am. But I know inside that I want to do more than just be average, if you would. So the genesis of that whole idea in me personally started with that article that said I was average.
So a lot of people find themselves in that description, even ones listening today. So what were some of your first steps out of being average?
Well, I think for me, it was just trying to determine to use whatever I had inside of me and to take action on the smallest things. I think what people make the mistake is they feel like they're called to youth and they're waiting for the phone to ring from some huge Joyce Meyer to call them and take them on the road and let them run all their youth stuff. And that's never going to happen. What does happen is that whole concept of, the small opportunities. Mm-hmm. And so anything that was small. So for me, it was like for me, it was if I had a chance to go speak somewhere, which I enjoy doing. And I felt like that was one of the things that I was supposed to do. And so I would try and jump at any opportunity. I mean, obviously in those days for sure I wasn't getting paid anything, but if I had a chance, I wanted to go. Mm-hmm. Or if I'm a natural kind of encourager, so I would find myself with opportunities to try and encourage people. I wanted to exercise, like the Bible says, to exercise the gifts, to neglect not the gifts, right? To stir up the gifts that you've been put inside. So the prayer, a powerful prayer is, Lord, send small opportunities. So that person that wants to kind of jumpstart today, send small opportunities, Lord, for me and you together, for us to begin to use what you've put inside of me.
I love that.
Whatever that is. And I'm telling you, if you look for it, you can find it. It's going to come your way.
Every day, too.
It is. And I think you'll have a choice, whether you do it or not. And the more you do it, the more you use their gifts, the more you get. It may not be immediately, but there's opportunities that come. And you might even get surprised along the way, because we're talking about a book here today, or books. And really, one of the furthest things from my mind, if you'd have interviewed me when I was at Oral Roberts University studying, and you said, John, list 50 things you think you'd do with your life, writing a book would not have been on that list. So I'm living proof of that, exceedingly abundantly above all that you can ask or think or hope or imagine or anything. It's still a shock to me every time I sit down and talk about books.
And what's interesting is not only have you sold 2 million books yourself, you now have a company that helps wannabe authors get their ideas out in book form.
Yeah, that's right, David, and that's been a little bit of a surprise. Along the way, in addition to being an author, I've been the head of 3 Christian publishing houses, as well as the vice president at Thomas Nelson, which is the largest
That's
Christian
impressive,
publisher.
Yes.
And so I'm like an actor-director, so I've been on both sides of the coin there. And over the years, people always have asked me, what do I think about their book idea, or what should they do? They've asked me questions, but in the last number of years, we've begun to really help people with their books, because there's a lot of people that really have something to say, and it could be on different levels. And so we've stepped up, and we've have different programs where we help authors. If they're just beginning out, we have a program that helps with that. And honestly, David, I mean, we've worked with some very well-known folks that most of your listeners, all your listeners would know, mm-hmm. with their books mm-hmm. over the years. And it's not ghostwriting per se, but it's similar to that. In the business they call it collaboration, but we do a lot of that where we come in and we interview authors. We take the materials, maybe they've preached a series on something, and we help them create a great book. And the other things like great titles. A title is really important. That book, An Enemy Called Average, I mean, that title alone helps sell a lot of copies, and even this new one.
Okay, this new one that we'll talk about today here after the break is called Genuine Imitation, which, of course, is an oxymoron.
Right.
How do these ideas come to you?
I'm a collector. I collect stuff. I mean, I've this book in particular was probably one of the most challenging ones for me to write. I literally collected information, ideas, and thoughts from others and myself over a 15-year period. And it sat there and it bothered me for a long time because I would never get to it. I never could quite find the right, I don't know what the word is, the right kind of spirit about the book for me. But these ideas...
What do you mean by that?
Well, for me, and I can only speak for myself, I usually have kind of a focus that I feel like the book has. And so, obviously when you write a book, An Enemy Called Average, you're attacking mediocrity. If you're writing a book, I have a book called Let Go of Whatever Makes You Stop. So you're talking about things that hold you back and things that can create momentum. I have one called Know Your Limits, Then Ignore Them. So we're trying to take the lid off of people. But I usually have kind of a focus. And in this book was I was, and a lot of the books that I have written, the people that have responded have been people that are trying to do more and trying to be successful with God's help and trying to do the right thing and use what's inside of them. And so there's a certain kind of energy that's there. And this book, I think, speaks to people like that too, but also some people that may have given up. I really felt a pull to people that have been disappointed. Maybe they've had bad experiences at churches, and nothing. Maybe the church is fine, but maybe their process of how they handled it didn't work for them, or they got offended by other folks. I was really wanted to speak to that thing that the gifts and calling are without repentance. God still can use you. That you don't need to let anybody speak into your life, kind of an idea. Right. So this one was different, and I wanted to make sure it wasn't an attack book at all, but still had that encouraging spirit about it.
So it's the kind of book you could give to anybody.
Yes, and especially people, I think, that maybe have kind of given up.
Okay.
In a lot of ways. It's different.
Why don't we take a break? Because you've listed some interesting characteristics about possible readers of this book, and I think possible listeners of today's program. So we're going to take a break and give our listeners that are already tuned in a chance to call a friend and tell him or her that John Mason is on today's Road Show. I'm David Warren, your host, and we'll both be back after this. I'm David Warren, here with some exciting news for Oasis listeners. We have a new mobile device app. It's free, easy to download, and lets you enjoy our refreshing music and talk everywhere you go. If you have an Android cell phone, go to the Google Play Store. And if you have an iPhone or iPad, visit the Apple Store and search for Oasis Radio Network. Be an Oasis ambassador and share this news with family and friends around the world.
There's food for the hungry, joy for the sad. I found an oasis of love. Oasis Network.
John Mason is with us today. I'm David Warren, your host, and John has written this new book entitled Genuine Imitation, subtitled Now is the Time to Be Your Authentic Self, Full of Hope and Freedom. And earlier, John, you mentioned that you really started a new writing style, at least in Christian publishing, 2-page chapters.
Yes, that was interesting. This first book back in 1990, nobody was doing that back then. They're writing really short chapters, and yet I had this idea that was about my level of attention span. I knew people were busy. And I wanted to give, I hated books, David. I hated books that you had to read 20 pages to get one point. I'm like, come on, give me the point. And I thought, I'm going to give you 20 points on one page instead of 20 pages to get one point. And I began to try and demand that of myself when I wrote. So it almost like every line would count. Every line would stand on its own. And so that became challenging to write like that so that you could cover a lot of territory and have it, substantial. And it was only 2 pages long. And people responded.
John, I've asked a lot of Christian songwriters how they write a song, like what inspires them. Do they wait to feel something or do they just start writing? What is it like for someone like you who writes one-liner nuggets? Do you just sit down and say, I'm going to come up with some today, or do they just come to you?
I'm not a guy that, say I'm going to do it today because I won't get anything. I'm always looking for them. I tell my authors this, and I've applied this to myself. I put the author hat on. So, like, I believe that you can put, like, you put your dad hat on and you read your Bible, God will talk to you like a dad, And if you put the author hat on, then you begin to see things from the viewpoint of your book. So you could be driving down the road. I had a nugget I wrote one time just based on a billboard I saw. And it was just a phrase on a billboard that I changed the wording on it, but kind of the flow of it was similar. And I got that from just seeing a billboard. And so I would put the author hat on. So for me, I'm continually collecting. So I encourage my authors, a short pencil is better than a long memory. So have a way to capture your thoughts. So nowadays, back then I had to have a notebook with me everywhere. But nowadays you've got your phone and you can collect the things. You can take a picture of it or whatever. But if you're doing that, that's what you need to do. So I collect, but my strategy personally to write is I go away to write. So I talk to my authors. There's different ways. Some people are very disciplined. They'll write 300-400 words a day, or they'll have a goal every week to do so much, or they'll try and do it that way, and that works for them. But for me, I mostly have collect, and then I go away now I go to a particular place that I know works for me, and I work from that kind of place.
Do you copyright your nuggets?
I don't, but the books are copywritten. And I quote a lot of people too. The other thing that I've never been hesitant to do is to quote others. I think it was Montague who said, I quote others in order to express myself more effectively. So if I come up with a thought, but I find somebody else that says it better, that I think will stick better with the reader, I'm not afraid to use that person, give them credit, and use that quote in the book.
I find that in this new book, Genuine Imitation, by you, our guest John Mason, you'll put a John Mason quote and then other quotes that are similar but different.
Yeah, I mean, they may say the essence of the point I'm trying to make in the bigger nugget, but they say it better, or they say it from a different perspective. And sometimes just who it is that's saying it, creates a lot more value to it.
Okay, the new book again is called Genuine Imitation, and there are a lot of stories from your own personal life, and really stories that got you to where you are today. I want you to read a little bit for our listeners on today's program, and it's chapter 38, Stay Away from Negative People. They have a problem for every solution. Read to us if you would.
I'd be glad to. This happened a long time ago at a point in my life before I'd written any books, and I wasn't very successful at that point in my life. And so the story goes like this. Once a month, the church that I would attend would have a men's luncheon, and it was sponsored by the church. They would have a nice buffet. They would have a speaker come in. They would share for a while. We would eat, listen to the speaker, and it would go from 12 to 1. Mm-hmm. And again, I wasn't very successful at that point in my life at all. And as I wrote here in the book, I would describe myself as an unsuccessful person. In fact, if you had told me you wanted to be successful, I would have said to look at my life and do the opposite. So I'll never forget the one particular luncheon that I had gone to, and later I didn't have any idea. And this is so God, because you just go through your normal day and things end up being defining moments in your life. And this certainly was for me. I was sitting there listening to the speaker. I don't even remember what I ate or even what the speaker said. I began to hang out at the restaurant. Everybody else had left. It was gone. It was supposed to go from 12 to 1. And I found myself hanging out with, as I said, 5 or 6 other men, and I can only describe them here in a favorable way as very unproductive Christians. Mm-hmm. And I'm hanging out with them. The kind of people that have had 4 jobs the past 2 years, the kind of people that are saying all the time, God told me to do this week, God told me to do that next week, God told me to do something next the third week, and they're going in all different kinds of directions, and I'm hanging out with them. And I'll never forget, it was 1:45 in the afternoon.
Wow.
Now that ought to tell you, David, how productive I was, how diligent I was, how much work I had to do.
Not much.
How much I was setting my hand to the plow, right? And I'm hanging out with these guys, these very unproductive Christians. And if you listen to our words, if you really listen to what we were saying, here's what we were all talking about. We were all talking about why we're not successful. If you listen to our words, we're all talking about why we're not successful. And I'm participating in there with all of them. In fact, David, I was an authority on that subject. I was just sitting there talking about why we're not successful. And this is true what happened to me. Right in the middle of that conversation, I felt the Lord speak to my heart. And he said, John, you're becoming exactly like these guys. And trust me, I didn't want to be anything like them. I didn't. He said, you're becoming exactly like them. And then he continued. He said, there are some people I don't want you to be around anymore. And he gave me their names. And he began to list off some names that he didn't want me to be around anymore. And then he continued even further and he said, There are some people that you can be around, but only for a certain amount of time in certain circumstances. And again, I heard these names come to me. And this is what's cool about God, is that he doesn't take you out of the darkness and leave you in the dust. He takes you, as the Bible says, from the darkness and translates you into the light. And so he continued to speak to my heart. He said, there are some people I want you to be around. And he gave me, David, he gave me 3 names. Those were people who knew me. Those were people who saw the gift in my life, the call in my life. Those were people that after I was around them, I was better. I was not worse. I was even nicer to my wife after being around these guys. They brought out the best in me. I remember distinctly, immediately getting up from my table. I walked out of that restaurant. I went to the southwest corner of that parking lot. I pointed my finger towards heaven, and I said, God, I will do it. I drove straight home. Now, back then, you had to go home to make a phone call. So I go all the way home. I got on my phone. I can remember, I can picture it right now. I can picture myself standing at the phone on the wall, calling these 3 guys and saying, I hope you don't mind, but can I get together with you on a regular basis? They all said yes, and my life changed. I noticed a change that day, and I certainly noticed a change as I began to walk that out. I chose to associate with the right people. And for the rest of my life, I've tried to be best friends with those who bring out the best in me. And that's a good word for everybody. Mm-hmm. And you're only going to be as good as the people you surround yourself. So be brave enough to let go of those who keep weighing you down. So I challenge people in this, even in my book, and even for our listeners here today, as I'm sharing this story, many times I've shared this story before.
People are relating to this.
Yes, and names come to them sometimes.
Yeah.
And I would challenge you, if you're listening today, and I've told that story, and names have come to you, it may be the Holy Spirit directing you to maybe say no or not as much, or maybe you need to say yes to some people that God's divinely, maybe need to make some time to invest in good relationship. God blesses people through people. Mm-hmm. This is what he does. And I found that to be true. And sometimes the answer to our prayer is a change in relationships or an investment in relationships. So I wrote this: if you hang around 5 confident people, you'll be the 6th. If you hang around 5 smart people, you will be the 6th. If you hang around 5 successful people, you will be the 6th. If you hang around 5 idiots, you will be the 6th.
John, I think it's easy, when we pray and ask the Lord, Lord, who is in my life now that should not be in my life? And then, of course, I have to have the courage to kindly walk away from that relationship. But for those mentors in my life, where do I find these people?
Well, I find, first of all, I pray to ask God to send me those people. Send those kind of people into my life, and maybe ask him to reveal those to you. But one of the telltale signs, I think, is that they bring out the best in you. When you're around them, you feel more encouraged, you feel more full of faith, you feel more confident in God and in your relationship. And, they're the kind of people that are going to be there when you're not doing so well, too. Mm-hmm. So that's the other side of it. You can go back and see, and there's some, they truly are fair weather friends, like the old saying says. But I do believe that God has divine relationships for every person. And it's usually just a few. It's usually just a handful. It's not hundreds of people, typically. But I do believe that he blesses people through people. And here's the other thing, too. Like those 3 people in that story, they were the right people in my life at that point in time. But none of them speak into my life today like they did back then, because as you grow in God, your relationships change. And this is the other thing that I've seen with folks, is they begin to progress in God. And there's going to be people who are not going to want you to go on. They're not bad people, but they're not the kind of people that are going to add to your life or multiply in your life. And you're going to have to make some choices about maybe lessening the time or not even spending the time, or, where you open up your heart to. So I'm not talking about here not helping people that are less fortunate, not being around people that are...
We're talking inner circle here.
I'm talking about who you open up, as I like to say, who you let speak into your life.
Right.
That's one of my favorite things to say is not everybody has a right to speak into your life, so stop letting them.
So you're speaking into the lives of your authors, I'm sure.
Absolutely. As I feel like as much entree as I have in that area, I mean, sometimes it goes beyond that because you build incredible relationships friendships that I have to this day with authors that I helped many, many years ago. And sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's just, on a project basis and you're done and everybody goes their separate ways. But this is a big deal to me. There's going to be people that are going to go to heaven because of the friends they chose and people that are going to not make it because of the friends they chose. And this is a serious thing. And I think if you have kids, that's why you want to encourage your kids to associate with people that bring out the best in them. And like I was becoming like those people. And even though I was hanging with them, I surely didn't want to be like them. I didn't.
I have mentioned your authors, and I'm referring to authors on the Insight International Publishing label, and that is who has published your new book,
Yes.
John Mason, and the name of the book is Genuine Imitation, available wherever books are sold, also through online retailers such as Amazon and via your website, which is freshword.com, which will tell you all you ever wanted to know about Mr. John Mason. Again, on that website address.
You can get an autograph one there.
There you go, freshword.com. Well, I am David Warren, your host today, and when we come back, I want to ask about some of my favorite passages from this book, Genuine Imitation. Here's a great quote by today's guest as we go to break. If you find yourself in the wrong story, close the book and leave. We'll both be back after this.
The Road Show is a listener favorite, which airs each weekday here on the Oasis Radio Network, starting at 1 p.m. Eastern, 12 noon Central. The Road Show also has a great section on our website, oasisnetwork.org. There you'll find audio archives of select past interviews, plus guest lineup, and contact information and links to our Roadshow sponsors and its hosts. So join us for the Roadshow, whether on your radio or on your computer at oasisnetwork.org.
Here's a little bit about today's guest. John Mason is an internationally recognized best-selling author, speaker, minister, and life coach. His books have sold 2 million copies and have been translated into almost 40 languages. He's widely known for his humor, encouragement, memorable stories, and insights. As we are enjoying on today's program, many of these stories and insights are contained in his new book, Genuine Imitation. And so I have some of my favorite stories that I'm going to bring up to you. You've lived them, and so I'm just going to ask you about them.
Okay.
But I also picked a John Mason nugget that went with each one that I really liked. So let's start with this nugget. You say, the road of life is paved with flat squirrels who ran into the middle of the road, then couldn't decide which way to go. You say you're not a product of your circumstances, but rather your decisions.
No.
And then your life lesson that was associated with this was sleeping single in a twin bed. Tell us about that.
That was quite a story. That story, the basis of that, the power of making good decisions. I learned the lesson in this early on. I just begun to go out and minister. I got a call from a wonderful pastor up in Buffalo, and he was connected well with 5 or 6 other churches in the area, and he wanted me to come up and minister at his church. And so he did say that he had a requirement for guest ministers. And this, again, David, was probably 30 years ago. And so he said that I have a requirement, and the requirement is this: I want you to stay at my house, and I want you to fellowship with some of the members of my church before that Saturday night before the Sunday services. And I said, okay, I didn't really know much about this whole arrangement, and it seemed reasonable to me. And I was going to stay in the area and preach at 5 or 6 other churches over the next week or so. And so I remember arriving. I remember him taking me to his home straight from the airport. He told me to take my luggage and go put it in this room down the hall. I remember, hurriedly putting my luggage in this room and noticing that there was a small bed over on the one side of the room. And I kind of got out of there and headed back, and we had a nice dinner together, and we told stories and laughed and shared about the good things the Lord had done.
And you're the special guest.
And I'm the guest, and I'm the guy, and so they're asking me questions and things. So it was a very, very nice time. And so I remember him saying, okay, I'll we'll eat breakfast here, and then we'll go over to the church for the service tomorrow morning. I said, okay. So I went back to the room, and I walked in there, and only then did I actually notice that the bed that he had for me in this room was, the only way I could describe it was way smaller than a twin bed. In fact, I remember laying on the bed, and I'm only 5'8", so I'm laying on the bed, and my feet are literally hanging a little bit off the end of the bed. And there was absolutely no room to either side of the bed. And I laid there and I thought, okay, he's pranking me, or this is a joke. I mean, it's like he's playing a game with me or something. But no, I mean, it wasn't. And it was like the real deal. And so as I wrote, I said, I slept at attention all night. And I probably dreamed about falling off a cliff, either to my right or my left, all night long. So I didn't sleep very well. And I got up the next morning, and I wasn't that rested. I remember I preached as good as I could. But I determined, you have not because you ask not. And ask and you will receive. And I thought, if you don't make your own decisions in life, somebody else will decide for you. Mm-hmm. So I determined from that point forward, I was going to make sure that certain things, I was going to make decisions. And again, for people, the devil doesn't care if you have great faith ideas and beliefs and everything else if you don't take any action on them. Faith, we know, without works is dead, and works a lot of times is a result of making good decisions. And so I encourage, the people that are listening today, and myself too. This is a challenge for me too, that you have to get to a point where you say, okay, I've decided, I'm stepping out by faith, and I'm going to go do this and see what happens. And nothing changes unless you make a decision.
Were you ever invited back to that church to speak?
Yeah. I went back a couple more times to some of those same churches. In fact, I ended up building a really great relationship with one of the other pastors there.
What was your next bed like, though, the next time they asked you to speak?
I'd be candid with you. I only stay in hotels now.
All right.
All
right. The next nugget by today's guest, John Mason. By the way, I'm David Warren, your host. He says, your worst enemy can't harm you as much as your own unfiltered thoughts. Tell us about finding a bump on your knee.
Oh, okay. I remember one day getting up from my desk at the office, and I began to walk out of the office building, and as I did, David, I noticed that I had a bump on my knee. In fact, the bump was actually so big that it made my pants stick out right on the inside of my right knee. And instantly I had this thought, you didn't bump your knee on anything. And so I began to replay my whole day, convincing myself that I had not bumped my knee on anything. It's been said, don't put water in your own boat, the storm will put enough in on its own. Or as my friend David Blunt up in St. Louis says, stay out of your own way. And I began to build a case against myself, and we shouldn't do that, by just thinking, replaying my day, convincing myself I'd not bumped my knee on anything. And as I let that vain imagination come in, another one came. And this second thought was that I had had bumps before. I thought, John, you've had bumps before, and this feels different. This doesn't feel like a bump. Mm-hmm. It feels like a lump. And I began to give place to that thought. I began to think about that, and within 5 minutes, I now began to picture myself playing golf with only one leg.
I think you said it went from a bump to a lump to a stump in your mind.
Yes. I mean, through that kind of thinking, I went from a bump to a lump to a stump. And then, though, I did do this. I said, I don't know, our listeners probably do this too. I went, time out, John, you're so stupid. I laid my hand on my knee and I said, thank you that by Jesus' stripes I'm healed. And by the time I got home, that bump was completely gone. But I'd allowed a small thing to become a big shadow.
John, I think everybody fights
unfiltered
unfiltered thoughts. How do you filter your thoughts at this point?
Well, the best way is obviously, what does God's Word say about it? Mm-hmm. And that's I think the most powerful. Yeah, the filter for me is to cast it down. These unfiltered, negative, wrong thoughts because they never stay small.
That's a good
They want to grow. They never stay where they never, those kind of thoughts never stay the size they introduce themselves as. They always want to grow and grow. And like the Sweeties say, worry gives a small thing a big shadow. And a lot of people spend their whole lives running from things that aren't after them. They spend their whole lives doing that. And so as best I can, and I say this to myself, since I've told that story or written about that story, I mean, I have told myself bump, lump, stomp 1,000 times probably. I mean, I say it to myself.
Yeah.
Because we all find ourselves going there. I mean, you get something and you think, this little scratch on my finger, and man, you're dead in about 6 months. It's unreal.
In your mind. Well, it's kind of like David. He had to remind himself, I killed a lion, I killed a bear.
There you go. Yeah.
Here's another great quote from Genuine Imitation by today's guest, John Mason. He says, humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of yourself less. That's awesome, and that will preach, as they say. Tell us about trying to help that bag lady at the Mexican fast food restaurant.
I had gone to lunch at a very popular fast food Mexican restaurant, and because it was popular, I found myself in a line, mm-hmm. and right in front of me was a lady who you can only describe pretty obviously was homeless. Mm-hmm. I mean, I remember her vividly had this paper grocery bag that was kind of overflowing with her stuff. And I remember seeing her, and I can picture it now, her taking some change and putting it on the counter and ordering a taco and a water.
That's sad.
Yeah, so I get my meal, and I'm sitting there, and I'm thinking what every listener out there is thinking. I want to help this person. Mm-hmm. So I got up from my table. I went over to her, and I said, "Excuse me, ma'am, excuse me." I said, "Can I help you?" And she completely just didn't want to have anything to do with me and was pretty adamant about it. And I said, "Look, I want to buy you whatever you want. Mm-hmm. I'll get you whatever you want on the menu." And she still said no. So I went back to my seat, and I remember finishing my meal, and then she finished her, and she began to walk out of that building, and I followed her. I walked out of that restaurant. She walked out of me, and I began to walk a little ways behind her. And as she went around, I remember to the side and then towards the back in the parking lot area. And I went up to her, and I reached in my wallet, and I took out a $20 bill, and I got right in front of her, and I said, "Excuse me, ma'am, let me give this to you." And she looked at me honestly with some of the meanest eyes I've ever seen. And she said, "Stop bothering me." And she literally turned and stomped off. And then I felt like the Lord showed me this. He said, "That's the way my people respond to me." He said, "I'm up in heaven, and I'm wanting to pour out a blessing." And I forgot to mention this, but when I first went over to her, she asked me, "Who are you?" Mm-hmm. And in the same way, the Lord said, when he looks at us and we respond back to him, we go, "Who are you?" trying to bless our lives. And then he continues to try and bless our lives. And we say, "Stop bothering me." And then we turn and we live our lives apart from him. And I thought, how sad. But we do that many times, like that lady.
One more story before we go to break. Here's your quote. You say, "Excuses will always be there for you. Opportunities won't." You said earlier, just start with what you got, with the opportunities that come in your path today. Tell us about your opportunity of filling in for one Mr. Larry King.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I was playing golf with my son Greg, and we were having a good time golfing, and I remember I got a phone call on my cell phone, and it was from a guy named Peter Lowe who puts on these did back then put on these enormous success seminars, and he would have Zig Ziglar,
Mark Victor Hansen,
Mark Victor Hansen, Barbara Bush, Dick Vitale. I mean, it was like big name folks. Larry King was at all of them, and it was a Thursday. I remember it was a Thursday. He called me, and he said, "John," and I'd met him at a conference I spoke at a few years earlier, and we'd kind of struck a little bit of a friendship. He said, "John," he goes, "I need for you to take Larry King's place next Tuesday." And some listeners will remember way back, Larry King had some heart problems that came up, and so he was unable to be at the event on Tuesday, and this was Thursday, and he said, "Can you do it?" And I was like, yeah. And so I remember hanging up, closing the phone or whatever back then, and thinking, okay, this is a different kind of level, because I knew there was going to be like 15,000 people there, and Barbara Bush, if I remember, Ziegler, Barbara Bush, Dick Vitale, and I can't remember some of the other folks that were there. I mean, and I'll never forget, I flew down there the night before, and I kind of tossed and turned all night having this vivid dream of them. And Larry King was the last speaker. He told me, he goes, "Larry's our last speaker, so you got to knock it out of the park and leave everybody on a high." So all that night before.
As if these others hadn't already.
Right. I mean, and I'm like the last guy. So I remember dreaming or thinking at night, I was laying there going, I pictured Peter introducing me. Larry's not going to be here tonight, but we have John Mason instead. And I saw thousands of people streaming out of the building as I was trying to speak. But it didn't end up like that. It ended up being phenomenal. I ended up backstage with all of those folks except for Barbara Bush. But it was a wonderful thing. But I knew that, opportunities can drop in your lap if you have your lap where opportunities can drop. And I had been faithful, and I had been persistent, and I was ready as I could be. But I also enjoyed it, David, because I know that when God stretches you, you never come back to your original shape, and I was about to be stretched. I mean, I'd spoken from some big crowds, but this was very secular. It was very different, and it was a huge opportunity. I had an opportunity to speak for Peter a few other times after that, too, so that was wonderful.
Great. Well, question for you. Would you like to fill in for David Warren sometime?
I don't know. I couldn't do that. I'd be honored to help you in any way. And
there you go. We were going to sit here until you said that.
Okay.
I'm David Warren, interviewing the great Mr. John Mason, and his newest book is called Genuine Imitation. It's available wherever books are sold, on the Insight Publisher imprint. It's also available online through booksellers like Amazon.com and through his website, freshword.com. We're going to take a break and be back with some final insight from today's guest. I'm David Warren, Program Director at Oasis Radio Network and one of the hosts of this podcast. All of our hosts enjoy hearing from you, our listening family, so drop us a note. Our email address is roadshow@oasisnetwork.org. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast and you'll receive new episodes on your mobile devices. And now, back to the show. Well, on today's program, it has been a pleasure and, of course, an honor to have John Mason back with us on the program. Overdue, by the way, so he's got to come back a whole lot more often because he's one great guest. I'm David Warren, your host, and the book we've been talking about today is called Genuine Imitation, and it's got a lot of great stories in it and also life lessons that he has learned, and hopefully the rest of us will learn. Available wherever books are sold. Again, the name Genuine Imitation. That's the book, and it's available as well through today's guest's website, freshword.com. And some of the things you'll find on John's website, first of all, the bookstore. So this book and the other bestsellers that you have, John. Also, you're a speaker, and so the different topics that you speak on, An Enemy Called Average, and I like that you say, don't end up doing what you do second best. Then you have a topic you speak on called Don't Live Within Your Means. You say, know your limits, then ignore them. Also, let go of whatever makes you stop. You're born an original, don't die a copy. And also, you have to have a dream to make a dream come true. We've talked somewhat about you having different authors on your Insight International imprint. Again, tell us how you can help the Christians listening today who have this book bubbling inside of them. Does everybody need to write a book?
Well, probably not, but I think that one of the things I always ask authors, because I've had so many come to me over the years, is like, how long has this thought been in you? There's a persistency, I think, I've found from my own life, to God's direction. The Bible talks about many are the plans in a man's heart, but it's the Lord's purpose that prevails. And the second thing I always want to ask authors is, when you shared this idea with people, or you've used this concept with people, have you gotten fruit? Has there been results? Because the only kind of books you ever want to write are books that have gotten results. In other words, when we come in and work with authors all the time, a lot of them have a lot of ideas, but I want to hone in on where has God used this the most in terms of changing people's lives, in terms of helping people. And so if you have a message out there that you shared, and when you do, things happen, God uses that, that's something to take notice of, and it may be a book. So I encourage people, and your book may not be for, that particular book may not be for hundreds of thousands of people, but it may be for the right 250. And I'm a guy that believes you ought to do that. But don't write a book just to write a book. And make sure, the third thing I think I always tell people is make sure it changes you too. Mm-hmm. Make sure you're impacted by the book. Make sure something about writing the book does something in you. When I wrote my book, An Enemy Called Average, I was in one of the more challenging financial situations of my life. I had a wonderful marriage. Things were great. But financially and career-wise, I was in a kind of a struggle. And so it was interesting to write it in the middle of that difficult time. And I ended up writing it for myself. I found it was really helping me. And so then it didn't surprise me quite as much when it helped other people, because I knew it had helped me too. So those are some thoughts that I would share with folks in relating to books.
On your website in the bookstore section, you have a toolkit, so to speak.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Well, this is almost 20 years in the making. It's basically everything I know about publishing and writing books. And as we said earlier, I've been the head of 3 Christian publishing houses, as well as sold a lot of books and written 20 books altogether. So I took everything I knew. It's a 180-page manual. It's got video and audio teaching. And the tool is, how to write the book of your dreams and sell it everywhere you can. And it also includes a couple of consultations with me on the phone personally, where I evaluate your idea, I give you some feedback, and there's some other questions and things that we ask. And it's for those that can't really, maybe in their situation, fly me in to do a whole book thing for them and help them write their book. But it's something that's kind of in the middle. In fact, some people have bought that tool, and then they've actually brought us in and had us help create books for them too. So it's a way to help people kind of no matter where they're at with their book idea.
All right, that website address again is freshword.com. That's also where you'll find the new book by today's guest, John Mason. The name of the book, Genuine Imitation. And get a load of some of these chapter titles he has in this book. You're peculiar, so don't change. Thoroughly enjoy minding your own business. Go to sleep with a dream and wake up with a purpose. Here are some other chapter titles. You didn't come this far only to come this far. Don't believe everything you think. We touched on that one earlier. Be thankful for what you don't get. And also, color outside the lines. One more we've got here, and in fact, I'd like you to read this to our listeners before we say goodbye. It's from the Genuine Imitation book, and it's chapter 46, called Seize the Way.
I'd be glad to, David. And actually, this is fitting to have it at the end of our time together. I put it at the end of the book because of the topic that I'm going to address. The nugget goes like this. It was a brilliant day, and I was panicking. Having just left church, I wandered from the dark, air-conditioned auditorium into the bright noonday sun. My eyes scanned the vast parking lot of several thousand cars for my own, but it was nowhere to be found. My old Chevrolet Caprice Classic, broken front seat and all, had been stolen at church. Strangely, I had an epiphany. My thoughts flowed from fear to fortune as I thought, maybe it's really gone and I can get some much-needed cash for that old clunker. With each passing moment, I felt happier and happier with my newfound, quote, miracle, until I unexpectedly and disappointingly found it, parked right where I'd left it, hidden between 2 Oklahoma-sized pickup trucks. Now, what was I really looking for? A car? Not really. I was looking for change. You might say I was looking for change in all the wrong places. So many of us do that. We want others to change, circumstances to change, our location or jobs to change, but rather it is time for you and I to fully embrace the person God created us to be. John Mark Green said this, change. It can be hard. It requires no extra effort to settle for the same old thing. Autopilot keeps us locked into our past patterns, but transforming your life, that requires courage, commitment, and effort. It's tempting to stay camped in the land of That's just how it is and how it's going to be. But to get to the good stuff in life, you must be willing to become an explorer and an adventurer. That's John Mark Green that said that. You see, making a life change is pretty scary, but you know what's even scarier? Regret. As you make your change, as you step out by faith, don't be afraid of what could go wrong. Instead, focus your thoughts on what could go right. Change is not a painful ending, it's a new beginning, and you're about to meet the real you as you change. Playing it safe is really probably the most unsafe thing in the world. You cannot stand still. You must go forward and be open to those adjustments that improve you. Focus your energy not on recapturing the old, but on building the new. Stop looking for happiness in the same place you lost it. You see, nothing changes if nothing changes. Close some doors. They are no longer where you're supposed to be. And the final paragraph is this. The changes I'm presenting in this book can be uncomfortable. Maybe the changes we're presenting today can be uncomfortable. But great things never come from the comfort zone. Never assume that you're stuck with the way things are right now. You aren't. Don't settle for an unhappy life. Life changes every single moment, and so can you.
John Mason, thank you for being our guest
Thank
on
you,
today's
David.
program.
It's been an honor.
The new book, Genuine Imitation. I'll leave you with a great quote from the book as we say goodbye. It's a John Mason quote, and he says, "You must be odd to be number one." For John, I'm David Warren. It's been another great road show. You've been listening to The Road Show. If you'd like to write to us, here's our address. The Road Show, P.O. Box 1924, Tulsa, Oklahoma, 74101. Our email address is roadshow@oasisnetwork.org. The views of today's guest aren't necessarily those of this station, but we do appreciate and thank our guest for spending this time with us. The Road Show, an Oasis Network presentation.